Kenya is currently deep into the national budget making cycle, and the government will soon release its strategy for raising the revenue required to meet its financial needs. This will come through the Finance Act of 2025. Government revenue raising measures have increasingly come under public scrutiny, being criticized for being insensitive to the economic realities of Kenya. Still, it's important for government to collect this revenue because without sufficient resources, the state cannot run efficiently. Hello everyone, welcome back to the Vellum Podcast, where we unpack the latest developments across the policy, legislative and regulatory landscape. I'm joined by two guests. Please introduce yourselves.
My name is Dr. Charles Owino. I am the head of resource mobilization and strategic partnerships at African Economic Research Consortium, which does policy research across Africa and share policy outputs with African leaders, particularly policymakers. Thank you very much.
My name is Eric Kiniti. I'm the Group Corporate Relations Director at East African Brothers PLC.
Thank you so much, and I'll be your host for today. My name is Tete, and I am a public policy practitioner. So to start off, I'd like to ask the both of you, do you think it's realistically possible for the government to collect revenue without disproportionately affecting consumers and also without compromising business growth?
The government revenue collection is used as an instrument for putting resources together so that you can have expenditures in terms of development, capital, and recurrent expenditures. And it is very difficult with the current situation for the government really to go out there and collect revenue without really harming a majority of people. But what the government can do is to rationalize so that they broaden the base as opposed to targeting specific elements that they've been targeting in the past.
Yeah, I think from my experience, you need to be able to create incomes to be able to tax. And I think the challenge that we've had in the past is that government looks at the revenue collection aspect as first, without thinking about where does that revenue come from. So, as my senior here said, one of the things you need to do is to ensure that there's economic development. You can only get money if people have economic activity that you can be able to tax and get revenue from. So, in our instance, from the kind of business we run, you need to create opportunities down the value chain for your people earning money for you to be able to tax them. Even for us, for our own survival, the only way people are going to buy our products is if people have money. So we need to create those opportunities. And that's why for us, local sourcing is a very big component for it. From raw materials to logistics, everything. Because that's where the money is going to come from.
Yeah, and the simple way of looking at it in terms of an analogy, we want to put money in people's pocket so that they can be able to spend. Without purchasing power, people cannot spend. And the easiest way to do that is to give concessions to manufacturing so that they can expand. Because when I produce something, I expect people to buy. If people don't have money, they won't buy. So people voting for the production of a good or service by way of purchasing is what creates the multiplier effect. The more they buy, the more you can expand in terms of production, the more you can even employ more people, the more other sectors will employ, and the more money government will have in terms of revenue collection, because they'll use taxation policies to get money from people. So that multiplier effect is very, very important. The issue of voting for production of stuff can only happen if you have money in your pocket and you have a good purchasing power.
It's interesting that you both mentioned the multiplier effect and how an increase in taxation has a ripple effect down to how the consumer spends. How is consumer behavior being affected by the current taxation climate and the policy climate?
A lot of people will depend on salaries. There are also people in business who will depend on income that they generate from their businesses. If policies are crafted that affect the flow of income in terms of how you expend by way of taxing, it will definitely shrink their expenditures. And the same way, if their expenditures are shrunk, they won't vote for production of stuff. So you don't want to keep raising taxes that target maybe salaries or incomes. You want to rationalize so that you broaden the tax base and get as much as possible from as many people as possible.
When we move over to business, is this the same case? How has the taxation regime impacted the cost of doing business and also the production costs for products in the manufacturing sector?
It's a similar concept. I think consumption is a big aspect. If you look at the major economies, the US, China, they grow because there's domestic consumption, not necessarily because of exports. But what domestic consumption does, it helps you expand your markets, because the efficiencies you create by being able to produce locally help you to expand your markets and you're able to export. One of the things that we have done badly in this ecosystem is, first, we started putting taxes on raw materials, which makes it difficult for you to become a manufacturing hub. The reason why Egypt is a big exporter of goods and why most companies are moved there is because they give subsidies and incentives to manufacturers, not because they produce for their own consumption, but because they can export. And one of the things we've not been able to do in the last few finance bills and finance acts is because you're not incentivizing manufacturing. And that's how you make goods available for the local consumer, so that does not impact the disposable incomes for your local consumers. And one of the things that we have to do better is how do we ensure that manufacturing becomes the center for value addition.
You've spoken about how taxes could play a role in disincentivizing manufacturers. How does this, the taxation climate, affect the competitiveness of locally produced goods, both locally and internationally?
So one of the things that especially this current administration has done is introduce something called an export levy, which is not an export levy. It's actually an added cost to local manufacturing. And that does not make any sense. Because if you want to encourage exports, you have to make it easier for us to be able to manufacture and export. So right now, the competitiveness you're talking about, it does not exist because goods manufactured locally are more expensive. It's easier for me to produce in Tanzania or Uganda because the costs are higher here than they are out there. And that's one of the challenges that we have. So we have introduced excise. Excise is supposed to be a tax that's supposed to discourage consumption of products or use incentives that encourage use because of their goods that consumers are able to buy. Currently, the excise regime has been to discourage production, and that should not be the case. So we've started putting excise on products and raw materials, which doesn't exist anywhere in the world. So you're discouraging manufacturing as opposed to encouraging manufacturing.
Yeah, and if production cost is not checked, you see, like a lot of US products are produced in China because labor is cheap. It's cheaper there. If electricity is high, people you are paying in terms of their labor cost is high, the water bills are high. If there are no concessions on all this, that is what increases the production cost. So you really need to do something in terms of policy to make sure that all these inputs are at a reasonable price, that if you produce something, at least you can make money as a producer. But the moment you put premiums on all these production channels, everything will become expensive.
We've spoken about how an increase in taxes could curtail the competitiveness of locally produced goods in the international market, and also they have the potential to reduce consumer spending. I'd like to ask, does this have any implications for the revenue government collects? Because, for example, if the government is introducing a particular tax to boost its revenue, and that tax is counterintuitive in the sense that already competitiveness is reduced and people are not buying that product as much anymore, what implications does this have for the revenue the government is collecting?
If you target some products and consumption level is reduced, it means that you are not going to collect any taxes from this because people are not buying. If people are not buying, it means that they are not paying. Even if you go to a supermarket and shelves are empty, it means that people are not consuming some of the stuff that you may have had there before. So really, if you want people to consume, you should rationalize the taxes so that everything that they consume in terms of goods and services is affordable. But the moment the taxes shoot, the people will avoid those products. And when they avoid those products, it means that even they're sending signals to the manufacturers not to manufacture the same products. And that's why you'll find that those shelves will be empty. So the government, using its policies, can actually do a lot in terms of even encouraging consumption of goods and services.
We see that when products become very expensive, you can find that bootleg markets emerge and production of illicit alternatives as people try to gain access to the same products but at cheaper prices. Is this something that you would say affects the industry?
So I think the challenge you have is that we don't operate in a perfect market. So in other jurisdictions that have better enforcement, you can be sure that tax policy can get you the objective that you want to achieve. The challenge you have in the environment, enforcement is an issue. We have porous borders which are not regulated, which are not being policed. So you have to always look at the incentive that you're creating for that kind of behavior. And currently, like in Kenya, for example, 60% of the alcohol market is illicit. Not because of anything, because the consumer, first of all, has the income they have. They cannot afford the products that are formerly being sold. And that's a reality that we live in. And the experience we've had like in the alcohol beverage market is that in the last 12 years, alcohol taxes have gone up by more than 100%. And actually, it's only in the last 1 year where you've seen an actual reduction in taxes. And that's informed by research. And I like the work that the African Economic Research Consortium does, because you cannot do tax policy without research. You need evidence-based programs to be able to inform what you are doing. So when you increase taxes on beer at over 100%, the incentive for people to do illicit is very high. And that's one of the biggest challenges. So we find that we don't have enough money to give enforcement agencies to enforce. And that's not a priority. In actual fact, it isn't. But you can stop it by ensuring that you're creating a conducive environment and predictable environment. Because even for us as manufacturers, we need that to be able to invest.
And I can give an example of evidence-based policy work that we are doing with the Danish government, with the Kenyan government, on issues that relate to taxes. And in fact, the outcomes are already being seen. There's some impact that actually that research has shown. So that you don't want to do policies without evidence. You really need to do some research, get to know what exactly you are up to, and then on the basis of evidence that you have, then you can now craft for policies that are favorable to the market.
Okay. We've mentioned creating a predictable tax environment. We currently have the national tax policy. What would you say with regards to the implementation of that policy? Do you think we are moving towards a more predictable tax environment?
With the evidence that is coming from research institutes, of course, African Economic Research Consortium is one of them. And if the policymakers are able to consume some of these research outputs, then in the long run, we'll have a more conducive environment in terms of tax policy. The problem with the research and government, that linkage sometimes is very weak. You produce very good research that give very good recommendations, but the policymakers really don't take it up, because sometimes what recommendations would be in those research outputs might take longer. Sometimes they want an immediate answer. So that is where there would be a disconnect. But as long as the governments across Africa, including Kenya, continue consuming policy outputs that actually come from these research institutes, then we can see light at the end of the tunnel.
I think, in my opinion, the tax policy is good on paper. It's actual execution that has a challenge. So one of the things that I don't think the tax policy covers are additional levies that come outside the tax policy. So you'll find, like, now we are dealing with the extended producer regulations, which is introducing a levy. You have a sugar levy. You have affordable housing. All those things, no one considers them as taxes, but in actual fact, they're actually taxes. It's the taxpayer who is paying for all these things. So when you talk about tax policy, people look at excise, which no one looks at excise. How does it relate to VAT? Because a good that is being accessible is also paying VAT. So I think the one thing that we need to look at is comprehensively, what is the actual taxpayer paying? And I think that's a challenge the tax policy has not addressed. That additional levies are being introduced by national government, by counties, and no one looks at that holistically and saying, actually, there's so much money being paid to service public expenditure, and no one is checking or controlling it, and it's not predictable. I don't know what is coming next.
You had mentioned interesting statistics on how 60% of the alcohol being consumed in Kenya would be regarded as illicit. We've also spoken about consumer spending. How do you, as a business, manage all these intervening factors while still maintaining consumer sensitivity and still trying to be profitable as a business? What are some strategies that you're implementing which could perhaps be translated into the rest of the manufacturing sector?
So first of all, because we know we are competing with a market that is unregulated, we try to keep our prices down. So we have to create our own productivity initiatives within the business in terms of being more cost efficient, in terms of ensuring that our costs are low, but keeping everything else constant. And I think to this point I started on earlier, how do we create economic value to citizens in Kenya? Because those are the people who can consume our products. So how do we create money back to them? So whether it's buying locally from our farmers, buying raw materials locally, whether it's glass, labels, everything, we try as much as possible to source locally, because that's only where you put money in people's pockets and they're able to buy your products.
The tax regime for alcoholic beverage taxation was recently changed to tax the alcohol content in a particular drink. How would you say this has impacted the alcoholic beverage sector?
I must say that that's the most progressive tax policy that has happened in Kenya. And that's based on research, like my colleague here said, evidence-based research. Because we could demonstrate that, especially on beer, volume has been going down 30%, despite taxes going up over 100%. Even revenue for government has stagnated. Even during the COVID time, that was the lowest collection they ever got. And it's because of the fact that you have to create value to the consumer. And alcohol is alcohol. So the consumer is not consuming anything else. They're looking for the alcohol in the product. So you should be taxing the alcohol component as opposed to taxing a product. And I think that's the best thing that they have done in probably the last 20 years in terms of a tax policy that's evidence-based, that looks at what is the actual contribution and what's the multiplier effect across the entire economy.
Yeah, and that was as a result of the research that I just talked about, where Danish government and the Kenya government are doing together with the African Economic Research Consortium. And the former CS Finance, Professor Njuguna Ndungu, was very instrumental in this and really spearheaded that research. And I'm hoping that this cue can be taken for other products so that this cuts across all other products, and therefore we can stand to benefit in terms of research that comes from these research institutes and think tanks across Africa.
In your view, are current strategies to raise revenue, are they aligned with the broader goal of stimulating economic growth?
Generally, yes, because what the CS Finance is doing now is to rationalize and also trying to tighten expenditure as well as efficiency in terms of the money that has been collected. How is it going to be used? But see, it is easier said than done. You can say that we are going to tighten expenditures, we are going to look at accountability and efficiency, but down the road, things happen completely different from what your proposals are. But in terms of reading from the proposal, the budget proposal, he has tried as much as possible to rationalize so that it broadens the base of the tax and also see to it that expenditures are really reduced. And that is where our problem is in terms of government revenue collection.
What alternative or complementary revenue-raising measures do you think the government could employ, which would be less disruptive to productive sectors?
You see, the government is in a tight corner. Right now, the government will try to raise the deficit. The budget is about 4.22 trillion, and the deficit is actually over 1.5 trillion. What the government would want to do is to try as much as possible to not to borrow money from outside, which is very expensive. But the problem is if you focus on borrowing money internally, domestic borrowing shrinks the market in terms of those who would want to get money from to borrow money from commercial banks. The interest rates will go up. If the government is borrowing internally, the interest rates will go up and therefore also disrupt the market. So he has a very tight leg room, so to say. But perhaps what he could look at is grants from outside and also trying to look for bilateral arrangements that really can create some concession. But it is very tight for him because also the country is burdened by a lot of loans that we have. The debt burden is so huge. We are looking at over 11 trillion, which is a lot of money. And that is almost 65% of the Kenyan GDP. And you don't want your debt to go to that level. You want it at a level that is 50 or perhaps lesser.
And if you had a chance to sit across from the people shaping Kenya's public policy, what's a piece of advice that you would offer to help them strike a better balance between this need to collect government revenue without stifling growth and innovation?
Of course, they have tried to put some money on manufacturing, on improving on agriculture in terms of subsidies, education. These are the biggest actually sectors, health and all that. But in terms of revenue collection, depending only on Kenya Revenue Authority to raise the revenue that is required to run the economy, actually doesn't work because every year we have a deficit, and every year the budget keeps going up. So the finance minister really needs to work with other bilateral donors to see whether they can chip in, and also other countries in terms of overseas development aid to see whether they can also chip in. That's the only way that you can raise resources. But within the country, unless it is from Kenya Revenue Authority or from domestic market in terms of bonds and treasury bills, it becomes very difficult, and the CS finance really doesn't have much legroom.
I think, in my opinion, the best thing that the government would do to be able to spur the economy to growth is, first of all, create incentives for manufacturing so that you export. I think there are also opportunities for job creation through services sector. If you look at the kind of business process outsourcing that is done from India, I think we have enough tech expertise to do it locally. And we are so geographically well placed that if you want to provide services across the world, this would be the best ideal location. We speak good English, we are tech savvy, we have good internet services and speed. I think that would create jobs locally. I think the other component is about exporting value added agricultural produce, because we are producing quite a bit of stuff that is going to be used in another country as a raw material. Why don't we export that as an intermediary process? So I think there's opportunities for us to create that locally, and that will create jobs, because I think the biggest thing that government can do is create jobs. And once they create jobs, most of those jobs are going to be formal. So you can be able even to get taxes like pay as you earn, VAT on products, improve the cost of living, and that will definitely make a big difference.
Yeah, and value addition is actually critical. Much of our produce, coffee and tea, is used to blend other coffees and teas that are produced in other countries. You go to places like Pakistan, they import Kenyan coffee and tea to use for blending, and then they sell it to other countries, or sometimes even export it back to Kenya at a higher price. So value addition, actually, if the government, like I said earlier, the government is trying to put subsidies in agricultural production. If the government can also encourage semi-processing of some of our products and export at least products with value addition, then you'll expect to get more revenue as opposed to exporting products in terms of raw materials.
From a research standpoint, what would a sustainable fiscal framework look like?
A sustainable fiscal framework would be one that you have zero. You start from almost a zero budget. You see, the program of work that government has, that they budget for the whole year, you should have monies that you are able to balance with, in terms of your budget. You should be able to balance with the money that you're going to collect. But usually we start from a negative start point. If we want to develop and the country wants to grow, if you want to spur growth, you need to bring down debt levels as much as possible. And you can only do that by doing a balanced budget, so that a lot of revenue that you collect does not go into paying these debts, because almost 50% of what we collect actually goes into paying debt, which is not very healthy for an economy like a growing economy like that of Kenya.
We've spoken about the power of using data and research to inform policymaking. Is there currently any research or evidence that demonstrates how heavy taxation can reduce overall economic activity or slow down recovery in key sectors that have been previously affected?
Yes, we've had a lot of research outputs that we published, not necessarily even from Kenya. Of course, we have some from Kenya with the Kenyan economists who have done a good job. But we have a lot of evidence with so many researchers across Africa that point to the fact that you really need to have something that gives you a base for you to make a decision. All the research outputs that we do are basically geared towards recommending some policies that policymakers can actually pick and use in formulating policies. So we have a lot of work that has been done that point towards that, and a lot of work also continues to be done. We give a lot of grants to the researchers across Africa to go into those areas to come up with policy recommendations that can be picked up by policymakers to improve on policy formulation. So yes.
Kiniti, you had mentioned that there are other policies which are not necessarily tax policies, but they have financial implications. Do you mind expounding on that further?
Yeah, so we find a lot of government agencies bringing up new levies and taxes, and that impacts on the cost of, for example, for us as a manufacturer, on the cost of production. So you have a sugar levy, which is at 2%. You have a regulation on external producer regulation levy, which on any imports that I make, I have to pay a certain amount. And everything that goes out of my plant, I have also, if it's found in the market and it's not collected, I have to pay. So there are all these things that ultimately affect the cost of manufacturing. But no one holistically looks at all these things and says, so if my vehicle is moving from Nairobi to Machakos County and it's branded, there's a branding levy. So all those things count, because I would ultimately start looking at it and saying, do I need to brand my vehicles? Maybe not, because it's an additional cost to my cost. And that cost, who pays for it is the consumer. I have to pass it down. So I think that's the challenge that we have in this country in terms of the cost of doing business for a manufacturer is quite significant. You have a railway development levy that you pay for every import that comes in. That import doesn't matter whether it's coming to create value, because I'm importing a raw material that is not existing in the country and I have to pay for it to create value. You go to other countries in Africa, in Egypt, in South Africa, you don't have those costs. So if I was a global company and I'm looking at where to invest for expansion, Kenya would be my last option.
You had also mentioned the extended producer responsibility regulations, which is a topic of contention.
Yeah.
Do you mind explaining how that has implications for businesses in the manufacturing sector?
So the challenge we have as a business, because the extended producer regulations, first they create a cost for imported raw materials, which I think is a problem. Then there's a problem of the finished product, which I don't have a problem with, because we need to be responsible about what gets into the environment. So we should be able to ensure that the products that go out, whether it's glass, whether it's plastic, whatever, is collected and reused or is responsibly disposed. So the challenge that you have now, you're being charged both on the raw material and on the finished product. You can't have it both ways.
Double taxation.
Yeah. So it's double taxation. So you can only do it at one end, which I think is at the end use, where we can educate and work together with the county governments who have the responsibility of collecting waste, in terms of how do we ensure that we are driving a circular economy, and that end product, when it cannot be used again, how else can it be used productively in terms of its disposal?
We've spoken about making Kenya an attractive destination for investors and also emerging businesses. What would you say an increased tax environment does to players who want to enter the market? What does it signal to them? And what does this mean to the broader Kenyan economy?
If the tax regime is not conducive, definitely they will look for other markets where it is easier to operate. Like, for instance, even just licensing in Kenya. Processing one license can take you months. Some countries like Rwanda, you go there, within a day you have your license. So you have to create a conducive environment for any businesses that want to operate there can come in and operate easily. If your market is not well done and it's not conducive, you'll not get any people to come to your country to invest. So I mean, in terms of now research, a lot of countries that have used research to help them to make decisions on maybe even if you focus on manufacturing, how best if you want to create a conducive environment for research. We have a lot of research that also point to that. And when you do research and you get the evidence that this is what we need to do in terms of perhaps prices of inputs like electricity, prices of water, maybe licensing and all that. It gives you an indication that if you don't reduce either the level of what you are charging or make it easier to get, then definitely you will not attract as many investors as you'd want. And without investors, there's no employment. And therefore, if there's no employment, people don't have money in their pockets, and therefore they cannot spend.
Yeah, and I think I just wanted to add to that point. I think investors look at predictability. For an investment, especially in manufacturing, you're looking at hundreds of $millions investment. And I would want to know that nothing is going to change because my payback period stretches between 5 to 15 years. So if something is going to change between that period and I'll have sunk in investment and I cannot be able to recoup it, it is really hurting because most of the time you find people are investing on borrowed funds. So if I cannot know how I'm going to pay my debt, then I'm not going to willing to invest. So I think that's one of the challenges that you have because if it's not predictable, then I'm not going to take my chances.
I think the social accountability from the citizens is very important. You need to monitor how much your counties is spending and on what, because the government is going to, I think, give up to about 4 billion to the counties, the 47 counties. So our responsibility as citizens is to make sure that you monitor how the money is used so that there is social accountability.
I think for me, it's first to commend the government for actually using evidence-based research to determine tax policy on alcohol. I think the one thing that they have done well is being able to create a predictable environment. And to be honest, they have a real challenge in terms of how to manage expenditure. But I think there is also an opportunity to create awareness even to the public in terms of where the money is going and what and why the decisions that are being made. I think the public that we have now are more aware, and there's more sensitization to be created so that you send a positive narrative in terms of government expenditure, what is being done with our money, and how is it being utilized, and to create a bit of transparency in terms of how that is being done.
Thank you, Charles. Thank you, Kiniti. This has been a very insightful conversation on the complexities that come with raising taxes in a developing economy such as Kenya's. We've also covered how we can fulfill this need to collect government revenue while still protecting businesses and consumers. For more of this, make sure to subscribe to our channel and also check out our Vellum website. You can follow our social media platforms as well. And always remember to keep it Vellum.